You remember when it was really was history?
Okay, so hopefully you grab your cell phones, put them on silent or turn them off. Everyone around you will appreciate that. If you haven't had a chance to pick up a copy of tonight's book, it's available at all the registers that you passed on your way in tonight, and in about an hour after some presentation and some Q&A, I'll have a chance to pick up a copy. Once you paid for it, bring it on back in here, and our guest will be signing at the table right next to me. As I said, tonight is pre-war, leading up to the war. And in some people's cases, thinking that's one of the results of the relationship between these two men whom you'll hear about tonight was the war in some ways. This is about Pope Pius XI and Benito Mussolini. Starts in 1922 when both of them came to power, one as the head of the Vatican and the Catholic Church, and the other eventually become the dictator of Italy. And it's a story that sort of had an official taste to it for the longest time, in that it was a heroic church that does battle with the fascist regime. Our guest tonight has gone through a lot of papers, some of which have only recently become available to show that it was a lot more complicated than that. But this is not one-sided. This is not the church caving in to fascism or to Mussolini. This is a story of two men with big egos and liking power, who shared, both of them, a distrust of democracy, and both of them a visceral hatred of communism, and basically used each other in various ways. Just a quick reading of a review. This is by John Guar. If you know him, he's the award-winning playwright and is the author of 6 Degrees of Separation, who says, in part, the Pope's blessing gave Il Duce the needed credibility to take Italy and the Italian people where he wanted them to go. In exchange for that approval, the fascists provided the church with its only perceived bulwark against the forces of communism and the modern age. Enter Hitler. I can imagine Machiavelli overseeing the manipulations on both sides and saying either well played, or you go too far, or beware. Our guest tonight is David Kertzer. He's the Paul DePay Jr. University Professor of Social Science and Professor of Anthropology and Italian Studies at Brown University, where he was provost from 2006 to 2011. He's the author of 9 books, amongst them the Popes Against the Jews, which was a finalist for the Mark Litton History Prize, and also The Kidnapping of Edgardo Montero, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. And one more thing, because we know this is, especially from the last couple of nights that we've done these, this is a hot topic, and we know there may be strong feelings in the audience tonight. What we always ask is that when we get to the Q&A, rather than making a long comment, we would rather that you ask a question. The more people that ask questions rather than commenting, the more answers our author will be able to give before we run out of time for our Q&A. So please, when it comes to question and answer, try and keep your comments to a question. Okay, would you please welcome David Kertzer.
Thank you, and thanks for coming. It's great to be here at Book Passage, and I do like to see us all support independent booksellers, and this is one of the most impressive ones in the country, so it's great to be here. I was here a dozen or so years ago. The book, Pope and Mussolini, tells the story of the relationship of two men who would have a huge impact on the course of 20th century history. What I thought I would do in the time we have is begin by using a scene I use as the prologue for my book, and then have some comments after that, and then leave the floor open for your questions. There tend to be a lot of questions and even controversy about this history. So what I'd like to do is begin with the dying days of Pope Pius XI. Pope Pius XI would die in 1939 in rather very dramatic circumstances. So let me begin with that and then turn to fill you in on more of what happened between when the two came to power, as was mentioned in 1922, and the dying days that I'm beginning with here in 1939. Pope Pius XI was ailing, elderly. He sat in his room on this night in late January 1939 in his office, his study, with a cane against the wall. He was ailing. He's infirm, yet he's begging God to give him a few more days to live. For years, the Pope had been in good health. In fact, he was known as the Mountaineer Pope because as a young priest, he had climbed alpine peaks, in fact, over 100 of them. For years, he was a very demanding leader of the church. He insisted on knowing every detail, making every decision. But now, every step caused him pain. In fact, he had difficulty breathing. His asthma made it difficult to breathe. His varicose veins had throbbing pains in his legs. He lay awake at night, unable to sleep. And as he did so, what pained him the most was not his legs or his breathing. It was the feeling something had gone terribly wrong, that he had made some terrible mistake. In the daytime, light would stream into his office. There are 3 large windows which face onto St. Peter's Square. But now, think of the scene. He's sitting at his desk. It's nighttime. There's just a little bit of yellow light from the lamp on his desk as he's writing by hand this important speech, the most important speech of his life as a pope, as he sees it. The Lord, he thinks, has kept him alive for a reason, and he is pledged to deliver this speech, which is to warn the bishops of Italy about a great danger that they faced. He had summoned all of Italy's bishops. Turns out there were over 300 bishops in Italy at the time, to St. Peter's Square. It was going to be the 10th anniversary of a very important event in the church history. On February 11th, 1929, the Italian government and the Vatican had signed the Lateran Accords with the Concordat. It's this which established Vatican City, which did not exist as a legal entity before this, and also constituted an agreement between the Italian state, at that time fascist state, and the church. It was going to be at this dramatic event, the 10th anniversary, where he planned to give the speech that he was working on. If we go back for a moment to 1922, when early in 1922, he was unexpectedly elected Pope. Alchilerati, which was his name before he became Pius XI, had only become cardinal less than a year earlier. He was, in a way, the least likely person to be elected Pope, but it turned out there was a battle between the moderates, you might say, and the conservatives in the church. Their heroes couldn't get the 2/3 of votes that were required, and they eventually turned to this relatively obscure man who had spent most of his life as a church librarian, in fact, to take up the papacy, become Pope Pius XI. Mussolini came to power later that year, leading his ragtag group of fascist ruffians in the march, the famous March on Rome. Was appointed by the king to be prime minister. They would begin this unlikely relationship, this fascist bully whose background was as a left-wing socialist anti-cleric, partnering with this devout, scholarly, former librarian Pope. And it was thinking back on this alliance and where it had led that in this night in late January 1939 is causing Pius XI such pain. And in particular, he's thinking what has bothered him the most. Partly it was that Mussolini seemed in recent years to be representing himself as a god, kind of god or demigod, which of course the Pope could never approve. But worst of all, Mussolini increasingly was embracing Hitler, a man the Pope detested. In fact, in May of 1938, Mussolini received Hitler for a triumphal visit of the Nazi leader to Italy and to Rome. The Pope had fled the city, gone to his summer residence in Castel Gandolfo, ordered the Vatican to close its museums, to turn off its lights, literally. And what had happened in the months since with the racial laws and a variety of other things that perhaps we can talk about a little later, just led the Pope to be more and more concerned that this man that he had embraced, a man whose regime he had supported, Benito Mussolini, was basically turning bad and becoming perhaps indistinguishable from the Nazis who he loathed. On the other side of the Tiber, Mussolini was growing increasingly angry at the Pope. He thought for the last 17 years, he had been doing a tremendous amount for the church. When he came to power, he immediately introduced mandatory teaching of Catholic religion in public schools. He had mandated that every public schoolroom, every courtroom have a crucifix on its wall. He had released large amounts of funds each year to support the Catholic clergy, the Catholic Church. And in a variety of other ways, he had done many, many things to make the Pope happy and win the support of the Vatican. So Pius stays up late the night that we're talking about, January 31st, 1939, to write his remarks. These remarks are going to warn the bishops, to warn the priests of Italy that fascist spies are everywhere, they have to be careful what they say, warn further about the possibility of Italy embracing Nazi Germany and the disaster that that would lead to. And we know, because not only, I should mention, I mean, this book was written largely because of the announcement by John Paul II initially that they would open for the first time the Vatican archives, the church archives for this papacy. They had not previously been opened. It was only 2006 that scholars for the first time were able to see them. But they're just as important, perhaps, the fascist archives having to do with the dealings with the Vatican are extremely rich, not least because in this period, the fascist regime had a thick network of spies in the Vatican. And their reports, thousands and thousands of pages, which we now have access to at the Central State Archives in Rome, give us kind of inside information on various intrigues and activities in the Vatican that you'll never find in Vatican archives. We could talk about this too later if people are interested. Now, as February 11th approaches, when this historic speech is about to be given, as the bishops of Italy are flooding into Rome from around the country, the Pope, already weak, becomes weaker. He takes to bed. Worried that his voice might not carry enough to be heard, he orders that 350 copies of the speech he is now finished be prepared to be handed out to the bishops on the February 11th anniversary. On the morning of February 10th, the Pope has greater difficulty breathing. His attendants fasten an oxygen mask over his mouth, being careful not to displace his white skull cap. The second in command, the Secretary of State, Eugenio Pacelli, who's an important figure in this story and will succeed Pius XI as Pius XII, controversial Pius XII, rushes to the bedside, having been called at 4 a.m. And he is there as the Pope on the morning, early morning, February 10th, takes his last breath one day before he was to give that address that he had been begging God to allow him to live long enough to give. On the other side of the Tiber, Mussolini, hearing of the Pope's death, grunts in relief. He seems mostly concerned that the ritual requirements of, as the dictator of Italy, in terms of the funeral, might take time away from the time he's planning to spend with his young, green-eyed mistress, Clara Petacci, with whom he spends a large amount of time, although this doesn't prevent him from spending a large amount of time with many other women, which is another part of the story. But he is concerned about one other thing. He's very concerned, and here too, it's Mussolini's own papers and the fascist archives that are so helpful. He's been getting a series of these secret police informant reports, which have been informing him that the Pope plans to use the occasion of this 10th anniversary celebration on February 11th to denounce fascism and to create a break between the Church, the Vatican, and the fascist regime, and especially to denounce his intended embrace of Nazi Germany. So he's frantic about this, particularly because he's heard that the Pope has had copies of the speech printed. And he's worried that if copies get out now, it will be almost like a papal plea from the tomb, and therefore all the more powerful. And parenthetically, it's not easy to get the Italians to want to embrace the Nazis. They just lost 500,000 people had died in fighting the Germans and Austrians in the First World War. Plus the Nazi claim that they are the superior Aryan race was not really designed to get Italians to be very enthusiastic about risking their life to help the Nazis in their effort. They had a pretty good idea when Hitler talked about the Aryan race, he wasn't talking about Sicilians. So Mussolini, hearing the news of the Pope's death, is worried about this, and so he decides that he'll send his ambassador to see the one man in the Vatican he thinks can most help him, the person who's been very helpful in the past and in a position to help him. It's the man who, with the death of the Pope, is in fact the Chamberlain who's in charge of all the Pope's effects in this period. It is the Cardinal Secretary of State, Eugenio Pacelli. And Mussolini calls upon him to seize all copies of the speech the Pope had intended to give and have them destroyed. On getting this request, Eugenio Pacelli sends the order to the Vatican printing office to have all 350 copies of the speech shredded. This is the scene that I begin the book with, the prologue. But let me just spend a few minutes filling in to understand what was the relationship, why was there a relationship between the Vatican, the Pope Pius XI, and this fascist dictator Mussolini. Now, I talked about the Pope as being very weak. If we again go back to the early days, 1922, this was a Pope Pius XI who was a very strong personality. In fact, when cardinals came to see him, they would talk, and we see it in their memoirs, about how they would go into a little chapel, get down on their knees and pray that the Pope would not find fault in them. In reading the various ambassadors to the Holy See account of their meetings with the Pope, we have many, many accounts of the Pope losing his temper, banging repeatedly on a table, shouting until he's purple in the face, his displeasure. So this was a very strong man, a very, you might say, prone to temper, prone to, putting it another way, when he thought the church principles were being trampled, he would speak out and not care about the diplomatic consequences. Now, he made this deal with Mussolini. Now, Mussolini, as I mentioned before, came from this anti-clerical background, had awful things to say about the church and priests and bishops and cardinals as a younger man. And in fact, even when he founded the fascist movement in 1919, right after the war, initially its first platform was also anti-clerical. But then Mussolini made a decision. Mussolini was nothing if not an opportunist, and made a decision that if he was going to actually be able to come to power, he would need the support of the church. And he would need it for various reasons, but just to mention one of them, other than the socialist, who of course was his raison d'etre for his movement, that is fighting the socialists, the major party, mass party in Italy at the time was a Catholic party, headed by a priest called the Popular Party. So if he could get the Pope to withdraw church support from the Popular Party and encourage Catholics instead to support fascism, this would be a huge benefit to him. And again, the story of how this happens is told in the book. This would also, by the way, give Mussolini, who had previously been known basically as a big thug, with all these violent fascist squads going around beating, if not murdering people, it would also give him some international credibility if the Vatican gave its stamp of approval to his regime. Now, in the research I did, there are many previously hidden documents that shed a great deal of light on the nature of this relationship, why the Pope made the decision he did. But even more, and this is just one thing I would like to mention, and then maybe conclude with a couple of examples of the kind of documents that really are so revealing. The Pope, once he made this deal with Mussolini, they, within 2-3 months of Mussolini coming to power, appointed an intermediary, who would shuttle between the Pope and Mussolini regularly. He would meet one-on-one with Mussolini, the Pope's representative, over 100 times in these years, one-on-one. Nobody met that often one-on-one with Mussolini. The intermediary was a Jesuit priest named Pietro Tacchi Venturi, about whom almost nothing had been written before my book. Curiously, he had such an incredibly important role to play here. But he remained largely behind the scenes. What were the requests the Pope made? Why was the Pope happy to have the fascists in power? Well, partly it was fear of communism. You have to realize the Bolshevik Revolution had just taken place in 1917, so this is just 5 years later. The Pope, the Vatican, the Church was very concerned about the spread of Bolshevism, and they saw Mussolini as the man best able to fend off the socialist threat in Italy. But they also, you have to realize the historical background. Italy was not an ancient nation, it was a recent nation, and it was created in the 19th century, the latter half of the 19th century, only by literally going to war with Papal States. The Papal States had controlled a large swath of Italy, going from Rome up through Ferrara, Bologna in the north central. And so the unification of Italy only came about by armies essentially conquering the armies, the Italian armies conquering the armies of the Pope. Rome was only conquered in 1870, again by violence, by the Italian army. The Pope at the time, Pius IX, took refuge in the Vatican, proclaimed himself a prisoner of the Vatican, excommunicated the Italian king, excommunicated the Italian prime minister, and said no good Catholic could recognize the legitimacy of Italy as a country. No good Catholic could vote for parliament or run for parliament. And in this new Italian state, the liberty of conscience was proclaimed, freedom of religion, separation of church and state, all things that the church at the time reviled. Mussolini promised to undo this, to return the church to a position of power, influence, privilege in Italy. And in these monthly meetings, the Pope's emissary would bring a list of requests. I'll just give you an example or two. Well, one of the Pope's main issues were Protestants. He had this great fear of Protestant proselytizing, even though there were very few Protestants in Italy. And so he would constantly be making requests to Mussolini to use the forces of the fascist, repressive regime to stop Protestants from handing out their literature, holding meetings, and so forth. So that's just one example. There are many, many other examples, and I'd be happy to talk more about this later. So this is the kind of relationship that the two men had until really things began to go downhill. In 1935 was when Mussolini invades Ethiopia. Some of you will recall this. Is internationally isolated. There's a boycott by the League of Nations. The Pope is not happy about this, and here's another main theme of my book. When Pius XI begins to have doubts about Mussolini, the people around him, including his Secretary of State, Cardinal Pacelli, but many others as well, including this secret envoy I mentioned, are working furiously to prevent a break with the regime. They're worried that the temperamental Pope will say things in anger that will cause a break in the alliance with fascism. And this, they think, would be very destructive for the church. So they take all sorts of measures that we now know from the recent opening of the Vatican archives, some of which seem incredible, like basically butchering the text of the Pope's remarks to take out any criticism of fascism before they're published in the Vatican daily newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano. Again, we only now, with the opening of the archives, know this story, which really becomes more important from the 1935 invasion of Ethiopia through the imposition of the racial laws in 1938. So right after that visit, the historic visit of Hitler to Rome, Mussolini proclaims a new racial policy of the regime. It announces that there is a pure Italian race, something most Italians hadn't previously suspected, and that the Jews were not part of this race, even though the Jews had been living in Rome for over 2,000 years. Rather, they were some noxious foreign people who threatened good Christian Italian society. All Jewish children were thrown out of school. All Jewish teachers were fired. All Jewish government workers, civil servants were fired, all Jewish members of the military were fired, and so on. The Jews were all of a sudden reviled. This came as a shock to the Pope, Pius XI. Again, it's a nuanced story, which I try to get at with all its drama in the book. But anti-Semitism was rife in the Vatican, and there were many people high up in the Vatican who in fact believed that the racial laws were a good thing. That in fact they had been spreading anti-Semitism for a long time, spreading the ideas that the emancipation of the Jews from their ghettos in the 19th century was a bad idea. So there are these tensions with the Pope as he is angered by Mussolini's obvious embrace of what he regards as pagan racism of the Nazis, and yet those around him are preventing him from speaking out. So in the end, and let me just end with this so we have plenty of time for your questions, I see Pius XI as a tragic figure. I think he had a medieval vision, which was then prevalent in the church, of the world, and it did not prepare him well for the challenges that would occur as fascism and its Nazi cousin began to spread, and the disasters that were to befall Europe would be played out. And in his last months of life, I think he realized that this had somehow led him astray, even though he was not yet able to articulate a kind of ideology for the church that later with the Second Vatican Council would in fact be articulated, but that was still decades away. So that is, in brief, the story I try to tell in the book, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Yes. Did any copies of the speech that he was going to give survive?
Yes, so I made notice, I said that Pacelli ordered all 350 copies in the printing office destroyed. He did not, however, order the destruction of the actual pieces of paper the Pope wrote his text on. And he buried them, so they did not come to light until initially John the 23rd, who, so Pius XII dies in 1958, John the 23rd becomes Pope. And there had been a lot of rumors about this speech, and John the 23rd began to release parts of it, although not the parts that were most critical of fascism and Nazism. I think he was trying to protect Pacelli's reputation. So it's only with the opening of these archives in 2006 that we have the full text. I wish I could say they were a stirring break with the fascist regime. If this were a novel, that's I think how I'd have it. But, so from a certain point of view, they're disappointing. On the other hand, so they're not what Mussolini feared. I've read Mussolini's correspondence. He feared that the Pope was about to denounce him and call on towns not to support the embrace of the Nazis and so forth. And the speech did warn the bishops about fascist spies being everywhere. It did warn them about the pagan ideology of racism and being bad, but somewhat pulled its punches. So it's a speech that Mussolini is very glad wasn't given, but it wasn't the dramatic denunciation that it might have been.
But Pacelli was not. Pacelli was still working closely with Mussolini during this period and afterward.
Yes. So afterward, well, for example, during the Ethiopian War, there was this great problem. Italy faced this international boycott, the League of Nations boycott, and they were desperate that the boycott not extend to countries like the United States. Let me just give that example, which is discussed in the book. The United States was not a member of the League of Nations, but there was a bill in Congress to have the US join in the boycott. So he basically calls on, Mussolini through his ambassador calls on Pacelli to use the Vatican influence to prevent the US from joining in the boycott. And so Pacelli and those in his office instruct their nuncios and their delegates in the US to work through the churches, especially with the Italian American community, which then sends hundreds of thousands of letters of protest to Congress, and we know that this is the reason that Congress in the US didn't go along with the boycott. So just to give one example. After, and one of the things I also document in the book is with the death of Pius XI, we see the Mussolini's ambassador to the Holy See, the Italian ambassador to the Holy See, working furiously to see that the next pope is not like Pius XI, but is a pope who is favorably disposed to Mussolini and the Italian fascist regime. And the details of that are in this book. Yes?
Can you tell us a little bit about Pius XII? Because he was somebody who was first-hand assistant to the Pope and does things like destroy something that the Pope, the 11th, obviously wanted made public.
Well, I'll give you one of the other documents that I found that I think is revealing here. When the new racial policy is announced is in July 1938, and they're preparing the anti-Semitic legislation or laws, they're worried that the Pope will speak out against them. So Mussolini basically tells his ambassador to the Holy See, you've got to do something. So the ambassador to the Holy See says, well, I know the right person who's really influential, the world head of the Jesuit order, the superior general of the Jesuit order, who's a Polish priest named Ledachowski. He's been head of the Jesuit order worldwide since 1915. And in his correspondence with Mussolini, his ambassador explains why he's chosen the world head of the Jesuit order. He says, because I know of, quote, his implacable loathing for the Jews. And so he goes, meets with him, and this man tells him, look, Eugenio Pacelli and I have been really concerned about the Pope. He's getting totally out of hand. In fact, we think he's going crazy in his old age, that he's growing senile or something. We have to do something to stop him, but that Pacelli is at wit's end in knowing what to do. So, now I think, on the other hand, so Pacelli, let's go back a little while. The Pope, he had earlier on a different Secretary of State, but he chooses Pacelli in early 1930 to substitute for him, become his new Secretary of State. And he actually is very fond of Pacelli. He, in various times earlier in the 30s, mentions that Pacelli would be a good successor to him. And he sees Eugenio Pacelli as having skills he doesn't. Eugenio Pacelli comes from a much more privileged background, closely allied to a kind of Roman aristocracy. He fluent in many languages. Whereas the Pope, Pius XI, realizes he is likely to lash out and say things that are undiplomatic. He knows Pacelli would never do that. He's much too diplomatic, much too reserved. And he's someone who understands the realpolitik of the world in a way that Pope Pius XI realizes he doesn't. So he values him for all those reasons. And I think, when mentioned, Pacelli is summoned to the bed of the dying Pope that morning in February 10th, 1939, he has tears in his eyes as the Pope is dying. He realizes all the Pope has done for him, and I think appreciates the Pope's good qualities. But from his point of view, what really matters is protecting the church. And so what Pacelli thinks he's doing is protecting the institutional church and its prerogatives. And becomes worried in the late 30s that the Pope is, for a variety of reasons, no longer putting those institutional motives of the church as the number one rationale, rather being worried about these other ideological issues and moral issues. So, that very briefly is how I would see it. Yes, back.
Forgive this basic question. I don't know the papacy that well, and the Pope. You seem to be describing a situation where the Pope has changed his mind, so to speak, or he's evolving and he's thinking maybe he made a mistake. Those of us who don't know enough about this have heard of something called infallibility. The Pope's views are infallible. How does a Pope basically say I made a mistake? Is it ephemeral infallibility, or?
Yeah, well, one thing, I mentioned Pius IX earlier, who was the Pope when Rome was taken in 1870. It was only under Pius IX that infallibility became the doctrine of the church. So people think, that's always been around. No, this is a recent innovation which actually had to do with a period when the church felt very much under attack. It had lost the papal states, and the First Vatican Council in 1869 and 1870 was what proclaimed, over a lot of objection actually within the church, but it was something Pius IX was very much pushing. Anyway, that's just a bit of a historical parenthesis, but the infallibility doctrine has to do with what's regarded as the basic doctrine of the church. So I think the way that certainly Pius XI would have seen this is it wasn't dealing with questions of basic doctrine. He was dealing with more, questions of political and expediency. Now, I mean, even from the beginning, Pius XI realized that Mussolini didn't have a religious bone in his body. So he had no illusions that Mussolini was, some devoted Catholic, and that's the reason he was embracing the Pope. But he would tell people, sometimes you have to work with the devil. He said this at one point. If it will be to protect the rights of the church, or he's also another occasion said sometimes the Lord chooses unlikely instruments to work His will, and perhaps there's no unlikelier instrument than me. So this is, in that sense, he's clear-eyed about things. Yes.
Maybe your book doesn't cover this, but there's been books written about the détente between Hitler and the papacy. Yours seems to address itself to Mussolini. My question, and again, this may be beyond your research, has the church owned up to any of this? Its collaboration with Mussolini, its collaboration with Hitler?
The Concordat.
The Concordat, yes. Well, I mentioned they opened the archives in 2006 for this papacy, but earlier in 2003, the first thing they opened was the correspondence with Germany. And the result is there were a couple of books, one in particular, excellent book by Father Hubert Wolff, who's both a priest but also a very excellent German historian, which deals with these issues, and I would recommend anybody interested in the topic to read that book. The church is not owned up. That is, the Vatican is not owned up to this history, and I think that's unfortunate. Now, some national churches, like the French National Church, I think has owned up to its involvement in anti-Semitism, for example, and compromise during the Vichy regime. But the Vatican itself has not. And again, the history, there's been so much emphasis on the relationship with the Nazis rather than the relationship with fascism in Italy. There's a very different relationship between the two. In other words, with Germany, first of all, is only 1/3 Catholic. So 2/3 of Germany is Protestant. So for that reason alone, the Pope has a different relationship with Germany than Italy is 99% Catholic, at least nominally Catholic. Plus, of course, the Pope is Italian, and everybody around him is Italian, and he's like 1 mile away from where Mussolini is. So his influence in Italy is infinitely greater than it is in Germany. So, and that's part of the rationale for my book, that here is a place where the Vatican plays a huge role politically. Things could have been very different if it had not taken the position it did with respect to Italian fascism. Yes?
I don't think I heard your answer to the contact with the Polish leader by the emissary from the Vatican.
The Jesuit.
Right, the Ledachowski heard my answer about what? Excuse me, what was the question?
You asked a question about.
About him? I'm sorry, I didn't.
Contact with the Polish leader that was important as the Pope was dying.
Well, so that story is at various points in my book. I talk about how Mussolini could rely on the superior general, the world head of the Jesuit order, to help fascism, help the fascist cause. And let me give you another example of this. During the Ethiopian War, in early 1936, Mussolini was irate because the Jesuit magazine, some of you may know this magazine, it still publishes, called America, published something negative about fascism and about the Ethiopian War. And so Mussolini's ambassador meets with this Polish man, Ledachowski, the world head of the Jesuit order, and Ledachowski tells him, I'm going to fire him immediately, which he does. And he replaces him with a pro-fascist American Jesuit who takes his place and edits the magazine. Not only pro-fascist, but pro-Father Coughlin. Some of you may remember the anti-Semitic radio priest. So this is the kind of role that the Jesuit Superior General is playing in this period. And so he's very closely tied into the Italian fascists. Yes?
You talked about Pacelli in these hours when Pius XI is dying. Do you see any relationship between that and Pacelli's role in the previous Concordat with Hitler?
Yeah, so Hitler comes to power as Chancellor in Germany in January 1933. And virtually the first international agreement he signs is with the Vatican in July of that year, signed actually in Eugenio Pacelli's study in the Secretary of State office in the Vatican. So a Concordat, an agreement between the Vatican and the new German government, which of course has been heavily criticized for all sorts of reasons. The then Austrian leader, a man named Dollfuss, who a year later would be assassinated by the Nazis, was irate because he thought in giving apparent church approval to the Nazi regime and giving it legitimacy, he was undermining his anti-Nazi position in Austria. And of course, by 1938, the Germans would have taken over Austria. So, but again, Pacelli did this not because, John Cornwell has this controversial book called Hitler's Pope. He certainly wasn't Hitler's Pope. He obviously was not a Nazi by any means, but he was someone who thought first and foremost what you need to do is protect the institutional interests of the church. And with the Nazis coming to power, he thought this was the way to do it through a Concordat. I mean, the other aspect of this, it actually recalls what had happened in Italy 11 years earlier. Remember that one of the major obstacles to Mussolini taking power and then becoming a dictator was the Catholic Popular Party in Italy. He needed to get the Pope to withdraw support for that party. Similarly, in 1933, the major party was the Center Party, the Catholic Center Party. In fact, the previous head of government was a Center Party, Catholic Center Party representative. And so this too happens in those early months of 1933 after Hitler first becomes Chancellor. The Center Party, losing church hierarchy support, dissolves. And that does help pave the way to Hitler's consolidation.
In consequence of the Concordat.
Excuse me?
In consequence of the Concordat.
No, it actually happened just before the Concordat. But before that, the hierarchy, the Catholic Church hierarchy in Germany had made clear its support of that if you were Catholic, you're a good Catholic, you should be supporting the Center Party, the Catholic Center Party. It then, in this period, as these negotiations were going on, backpedaled and basically announced that that was no longer their position. Previously, it was regarded as you couldn't be a Catholic and be a Nazi. And they backpedaled from that position too. So this all happened over the same months as the Concordat was being negotiated. Yes?
Yeah, when you refer to this moment, his last night in February of 1939, Pope Pius XI, has used an expression, something like he suddenly was concerned that Mussolini and Italy would be going over to the Nazis. To the uneducated listener, it would seem like this is almost a Pope who, this is a Pope who's almost a hero, ready to leave some noble cause. But for 2 years prior, Mussolini had his whole, at least 40,000 Italian fascist troops in Spain in the Spanish Civil War, which you do not refer to, by the way. And he had his Italian bombers bombing Barcelona almost every night. So the whole world was well aware of the fact that Mussolini was allied with Hitler, who also had his troops, bombing in Spain for 2 years. So Pope Pius XI maybe woke up to reality that his last moment. But in fact, in 1938, I just happened to do some research, he denounced the Spanish government, which was fighting Hitler and Mussolini. So he was complicit. He was totally complicit. So I don't see anything honorable about his position of, maybe distancing, because he had already brought Italy and his people, his flock of Catholics, to support Mussolini, who was allied with Hitler, who was already carrying out genocide with Franco for 2 years in Spain. So what gives here? What was his real state of mind?
Well,
The real
it's
question I have, sir, is what is the money trail? Did the Vatican support Mussolini, and does your research support, or do the archives support the money trail of the Vatican giving money to support Mussolini's war machine in Spain?
No, I don't think money flowed in that direction. But let me I mean, this is an important question: the Spanish Civil War and its relationship to all this, and it is a significant part of my book. I didn't get into it,
Good.
in the time I had here. But it's complicated. I mean, in terms of the Pope and how we view him, and there's room for different interpretations of the Pope. And I certainly, my book is not a heroic, portrait of this Pope, but he was, for example, when the beginning of the war, he didn't like Franco, and the reason he didn't like him, in part, was his relationship with Hitler. He never had fond thoughts, Pius XI, about Franco, and he always had doubts about him. On the other hand, for the church, the Republican government, the legal government of the country, was anti-clerical, was taking away various privileges the Spanish church had. Of course, the Spanish church historically was very close to the government and leadership and the elite. And so it was a widespread view certainly in the Italian church, but beyond the Italian church, that Franco was fighting for the church, and the other side was this communist, anti-clerical, and so on, who had been taking away privilege of the church. So in that context, if you actually read the archives, the Pope, again, I'm not trying to make him a hero, but he actually was one who was acting as a bit of a brake, not a huge brake, but a bit of a brake on the enthusiasm for Franco's cause. Interestingly, one of the first things Pacelli does when he becomes Pope is, it happens to be right around the time when Franco has his final victory. The war breaks out, the revolt by Franco, in July 36, and then in basically 39, it's largely over. So one of the first things as Pope Pius XII does is he sends a message to Franco and his government congratulating them on their great victory. Pius XI would never have done that. So again, maybe it's relative, but I think there are distinctions here, and I do try to make them in the book. Yes?
Yeah. Just to go back to John Cornwell and Hitler's Pope, it seems to me that Pius XI actually laid the ground for Pius XII to take some of the pro-Hitler positions, and that it didn't finish in 1945 because they were still at that point issuing Vatican passports for Nazis to leave Italy and go to South America. So how do you estimate the influence of Pius XI on Pius XII?
Yeah, so of course there has been some good work done on the so-called rat line after the war, where people very close to the Vatican, bishops and others, were active trying to spirit Nazi war criminals out of Europe and largely to South America. How this all relates to Pius XI's influence of Pius XII, I guess I don't see it myself. I mean, I see the two as quite different. For me, Pius XI, again, he's, my book explains that I think fascism, the dictatorship in Italy, only became possible because of the action of the Vatican and Pius XI. So, this is the context here. But Pius XI, I think, has a certain kind of deep moral sense, again, with his own largely medieval perspective of the church. And so I find it hard to see how he would tolerate that. Again, when we talk about popes, the other thing often that we don't recognize is as popes age, because except for our most recent example, popes die in office. It's very different when you talk about the relatively young, vigorous pope and the last years, certainly the last years of John Paul II, he was basically out of commission. Even Benedict XVI was, largely missing in action in the last perhaps couple of years in office in the papacy. So, yes, but I guess I would like to think anyway that Pius XI wouldn't have turned a blind eye the way Pius XII did to that kind of activity. Sure.
Did he object to the racial laws?
Pius XI?
Yes.
Yeah, well, this is a complicated story, but one thing I discovered in the research, in fact, probably the most explosive document that's come to light as a result of my work, but also a couple of others who've been working in these newly open archives, is an agreement that was worked out between the Pope and Mussolini 2 weeks before the racial laws were first announced, where the Pope would agree to be silent and be sure that no clergy criticized the anti-Semitic laws when they were announced in exchange for certain benefits for Catholic organizations.
This is 1938?
This is 1938. It was August 17th, 1938. So just very briefly here, just because this is kind of one of the major explosive findings in the book, Mussolini bragged to Hitler, in fact, I know and I can give you lessons on how to manipulate the Pope, and it's worked great for me. That's basically what he says. And what he knew, and one of the things he knew, is that what the Pope felt most strongly about, what's most dear to him, was an organization called Catholic Action. Many of you may be familiar with it. It's an organization of Catholic laity under ecclesiastical control. And from Pius XI's perspective, its role was the crucial role of spreading Christian influence throughout Italian society. So Mussolini knew if he ever wanted to put pressure on the Pope to get something to benefit him, all he had to do was put pressure on Catholic Action and then promise, okay, I'll relieve the pressure on Catholic Action if you do, X. So in this case, worried that the Pope would speak out against the racial laws. And here we get into the whole question of anti-Semitism in the church, which I haven't really talked about, but putting that aside for a moment, that he was worried that Mussolini was worried the Pope would speak out against the racial laws. And so he took action against Catholic Action. He, for example, announced that from now on, you cannot be a member of the Fascist Party and a member of Catholic Action. And various other things like this. Well, this alarmed the Pope. And in this agreement that's signed, it has 3 points. Points 2 and 3 are to benefit Catholic Action, including removing that ban on being a member of Catholic Action and a member of the Fascist Party, removing some fascist officials who were very anti-clerical and so forth. And in exchange, point 1, this agreement says that as long as the anti-Semitic measures announced in the racial policy are no worse than those that were enforced on the Jews, as long as the popes had influence, as they did in the ghetto in Rome until 1870, that the Pope will ensure that nobody in the church voices any criticism of them. And this deal was signed. It was negotiated by that Jesuit envoy of the Pope I mentioned, shuttling back and forth. It was a deal, actually, the Pope never felt good about. And Pacelli and others around him over these next months are worried that he's in fact not going to abide by it, and so do various things to try to ensure that he doesn't stray too far. But so that's the story is told in more detail in the book. But
just start one more.
As you study their relationship on a human level, did you think their bedtime reading was the prince?
Bedtime what?
Reading was the prince.
Bedtime reading. Oh, for Machiavelli. Well, maybe I will say that. Again, and this has come up in recent years in some of the problems that churches faced.
Well, I was mainly directed what you thought as you studied.
Whether they read? Well, no. What I was the reason I mentioned this is
they maneuver to each other.
But the question is, on the one hand, we think of the Holy See and its Pope as a moral force. This is certainly one point of view. On the other hand, you could see the Holy See, the Pope, and the whole Vatican bureaucracy as the head of an organization, very complex, large organization. And like all organizations, there's a tendency to want to, first and foremost, protect the organization. And so in that sense, the Machiavellian would be that, rather than the moral approach. And I think that led to a lot of what in fact happened, and that would largely explain what happens in this period as the church embraces fascism in Italy. And then with Pius XI's death, Pius XII not wanting to speak out against Hitler. Not least because initially he thought Hitler was going to win the war. Of course, this is kind of a minor matter. And he wants to protect the church in a Europe ruled by the Nazis.
Very Machiavellian.
Thank you.
you all. If you have a book, come on up. If you'd like to purchase one, they're available at the register.